I love my family. Family has always been important to me. Stay-at-home mom, a dad that worked very hard, 2 to 3 jobs a week. He was a worker. If your hands weren't dirty, he said you didn't work today. I'm the oldest. I have a sister, Kelly, and a brother, Ray. It was a really good childhood.
Tracy Wygant comes from a devout Catholic family in upstate New York. In the 1960s, she is a child growing up in an idyllic suburban life.
A lot of neighborhood kids hung out all day on their bikes. My parents had an above-the-ground pool.
My mom would make everybody lemonade and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Everybody came to our house to swim, and people wanted to be in our house.
Including the nuns of St. Mary's from the local convent, who adopt the Wygant family as their own.
They came to our house for picnics. The neighbors would see a carload of nuns getting out and sitting in the back with us and barbecuing.
My dad worked at Mount St. Mary's Convent. He was their plumber, and he ended up doing everything. We would go for Mass on Christmas Eve down at their church. Being with these sisters, the Catholic religion, it was constantly there. It's just really special to have them in our lives.
Tracy is so sheltered by her family life, she is tormented when one day she finds herself the target of a bully at school.
There was one instance where we were on the bus and he made fun of her and she started crying. I had a pickle in a jar from a science class experiment that I forgot was in my duffel bag. When he was walking off the bus, I swung my duffel bag and hit him across the back of the head. I'm sure it hurt, and I told him to leave my sister alone.
The problem with me, I was very shy and very timid.
My sister Tracy is the older sister. She's 3 years older than I am. But I really do believe that that is the day where I took on that role of trying to protect her.
When I turned 18, I went to Mount St. Mary's College in Newburgh in 1978, and then I just went into teaching.
Between studying and a part-time job, Tracy doesn't go out much.
When I was in college, I didn't dorm in this school. I wanted to be home.
But one day, when a friend asks her out on a double date, she accepts, and it's a date with destiny.
We decided to go out for dinner, and she comes with a man. He's a very nice-looking man. Brown hair, mustache, because they were big back in those days. And we seemed to talk a lot.
Tracy finds herself ignoring her date and is attracted to her friend's date, whose name is Chris Chanowitz. He's a local guy who works at a commercial offset printers.
He comes from a family of 5 kids. He grew up Catholic in the town of Newburgh, about 10 minutes from where I lived. I did think he was cute.
Tracy doesn't see Chris again until a few months later when she spots him outside a mall in Newburgh.
Kelly and I were going out for dinner, and I pointed Chris out to my sister, and she said, "Go give him your phone number." I remember being very nervous, and I went up to him and I said, "Call me sometime." And he called me the next day.
On their first date, Chris and Tracy go out for pizza and hit it off. Tracy has never had a serious boyfriend, and soon she is falling in love.
I had butterflies in my stomach, and I couldn't eat. I felt that feeling like lovesick or something. And then when I would come out of college, he would leave notes for me on my car. And every week he gave me a rose. I couldn't wait to go to my car and see the note. Like, you know, that was fun. That was like happiness.
Chris liked her because She has a good heart. She's sensitive, she's sweet. She was about to have a career. She treated him really, really well. She made him a priority in her life. He seemed absolutely perfect for her.
On Halloween night, just 8 months after they meet, Chris plans a special surprise.
We were going out to the movies, and he was really late. And I was mad that he was late. And he gave me a plastic pumpkin, and inside was all this candy. And I looked, and there was a box. It was a diamond engagement ring. He never really came out and said, "Would you marry me?" or anything like that. It was like typical me. Took it, put it on, we're getting married. None of the words were said.
We felt happy for Tracy when she got engaged. We did like Chris, and we were happy that he was going to be a part of our family.
It felt good. It felt romantic. We got married in the convent.
I was the maid of honor at Tracy's wedding. Tracy got married at the Dominican Sister Mother House Chapel. We always described it as like being in The Sound of Music. Right in front of you was the Hudson River. It was a dream of my parents for us to get married there.
It was all marble, all white, and all the nuns were there. My limo broke down. We got to the church late, and one of Chris's friends told me that he was upset, he was worried because I was late. And that always made me feel happy, that he cared for me, that he loved me. That made me happy.
Soon, the newlyweds move into an apartment and settle into a routine.
He left the commercial offset printers and he worked for Texaco company, and then he got a job in IBM. I was teaching in Newburgh. I got hired in August of that summer, '84.
Chris works the night shift on an assembly line.
And so I was home every night by myself, and I hated that. My sister, Kelly, and my mom, we would go out shopping on Saturdays. So Friday nights, a lot of times I went and I slept at my parents' house.
Tracy finds her first year especially challenging.
The discipline was so tough on me. I remember cans of crayons being thrown over my head, and it was very, very difficult on me. He went to work with me crying in the bathroom, in the corner, hysterical, like having a nervous breakdown, because the behavior was so bad, and I couldn't get a handle on it. I didn't know what to do. If he gave me some love, some hugs, telling me it's gonna be okay, I probably would have been great, because that's all I needed. But he didn't.
Tracy has her heart set on buying land and building her dream home, but it is difficult to save money. Chris gets a second job at a local business as a salesman.
He got a job at a woman's store with all women. And then women would leave notes on his car. It didn't matter if they were pretty, ugly, didn't matter what they looked like, he still flirted with them. Women shouldn't be leaving notes on his car. He's a married man.
Tracy complains to Chris about his flirting, but he doesn't stop.
He never hesitated telling Tracy that other women were looking at him. He did like to make her insecure, because then she clung on to him a little bit more, and he liked that attention.
After 4 years, they're no closer to buying a home, so Tracy and Chris come up with a new plan to save money.
We gave up the apartment, and I went to my parents' house, and he went to his parents' house. We lived off my paycheck and put his in the savings. I just never knew what he made. He never brought a paycheck home and showed me.
Tracy asked him if she could go stay at his parents as well. And he said there was no need for that, that she was better off in her house, in her own bedroom. We just thought it was all so weird. It was hard on the marriage, and Tracy cried a lot. She wanted to be with him, and he just kept saying to her, "You want a house, don't you? This is what we have to do to get the house."
For 2 years, Tracy and Chris continue their unusual arrangement, seeing each other as much as their busy schedules allow. Finally, their sacrifice pays off. They save enough to buy their own home, or at least Tracy does.
She has to pay for it all. We don't know where he would have the money saved for any of this.
We decided we were going to get a piece of land and put a modular home on there. We put a down payment on a home.
But before they break ground, in front of friends and family, Chris drops a bombshell that will ruin everything.
He told me he was in love with another woman. Her name was Shannon. He said that he was backing out of building a house. It was awful.
So Shannon was a woman who worked at the mall, who Tracy would see him talking to all the time, and never thought he would ever be with her. But what was even more shocking was Tracy's reaction to it. Tracy fell to her knees, held onto his leg, cried, and told him not to leave her.
Being a nice Catholic girl, you don't get divorced. I didn't know what to do.
Tracy Wygant's husband, Chris, has just told her he is having an affair with another woman.
Basically, what I did is put my head in the ground. It was sad. I didn't know where to turn, what to do. I didn't tell my friends.
He was done. But he wasn't done for her.
This is all I got. How am I going to get anything in the future if I don't fight for him?
6 months go by. Tracy continues to live at home, hoping Chris will eventually reconcile.
I had to go and get the money back for the down payment. There was no talk of divorce. And I would go to the church where we got married, and I would go in there by myself and just pray for everything to get better. And I would do that a lot.
And then one day, he shows up at her work unexpectedly.
And he had with him pamphlets for condos. So we started looking at condos. I was hopeful, because why would he do that?
Chris tells her he is no longer seeing the other woman.
I'm thinking everything's back, everything's fine. She doesn't exist anymore. It's done.
Tracy and Chris start afresh, and instead of buying a condo, they find another piece of land.
It's in Walk Hill area, out by the Schwanga Mountains, and we picked out a house from a magazine. It wasn't like he was like, you know, being all sweet and nice. I just settled and just kept going.
Within a few months, Tracy finds out she's pregnant.
When you have a body grown inside of you, it's wonderful and weird at the same time. It was also a very difficult time. We were building a house, and I'm pregnant.
Chris, he's going to be the best. He's going to build a house. He's going to make it bigger and better than everybody else's. Did they have the money for it? No. He hired people he knew, then didn't pay them. They were in debt.
Just as they finish building their new house, their daughter Taylor is born in February 1991.
Come see baby Taylor. This is baby Taylor's first Easter.
She was just absolutely beautiful.
Taylor.
Long Goldilocks hair, gorgeous.
Oatmeal and banana.
Yum, 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 yum.
Tracy goes back to work after 3 months of maternity leave. Chris is on night shift, so he takes care of Taylor during the day.
Chris took Taylor to the zoo, the park. He would meet other people, women with children, and I'm sure that he was flirting with other women. He would fulfill that role of the mother and the father with Taylor, because Tracy was working.
If we were at my sister's for a picnic, he would be with all the kids. And he would knock the parents down and say, oh, I'm down here with their kids, like he was the greatest.
Santa Claus was here. Look at all your presents.
Daddy, can I open some?
Can you open them? Sure can.
Yay!
Merry Christmas. Where's my Merry Christmas kiss?
Years go by, and Taylor grows closer to her dad, who seems to do all the fun things.
Hey, you.
I think most of my field trips, my dad came on as the parent.
Hi, I'm Taylor, and I'm at Macy's Parade. This is the fireman.
During parties, you would find him in the pool with us, having fun. My dad was always involved, always playing with the kids.
Hey, good girl.
But Chris has little time for Tracy, and their marriage suffers.
He said I have a stomach, so no sex. That was awful. We did Nutrisystem, and I got really skinny, and he still said I had a belly.
We felt that he was having an affair because there was just really no desire, no connection. And it was frustrating for me because I knew my sister was believing his lies.
Inside, I'm dying. No intimacy. I would cry and I would beg him, and he would go like this at me. Oh, really?
When her sister Kelly's family visits Disney World, Tracy suggests they join them, hopeful that a vacation might rekindle their intimacy.
Tracy really looked forward to that. The whole family walking around Disney World.
We took out a loan to take Taylor. We were together, and one night I woke up in the middle of the night and he was gone. I don't know where he was.
She said that Chris kept disappearing. We would be waiting for the parade, and he'd say, oh, he was gonna go buy Taylor or something, and he'd be gone for hours. She goes, I just have a feeling that he wasn't alone.
I was hoping for a change. I just kept waiting for that miracle to happen.
After they return, and just when Tracy is at her emotional bottom, her sister calls with more devastating news.
She told me that our mom died.
My mom's death was awful for us.
Chris had no choice. He had to be with me during that time. And then I had him go up to the casket and tell my mom not to worry, that he always would be there for me. I had him tell her that. And then it was Thanksgiving weekend. My family has a cabin in the Catskills with a gun club. So Chris says he's going up to the cabin and go hunting. And my sister could not believe that he was leaving me after my mom just died.
He would tell my father that real men don't stay in the cabin. They go off and they get a tent and they sleep in the woods.
Chris and Tracy's dad go to the cabin, but Chris disappears.
Now, Chris had a hunting gun, but he didn't hunt.
And my father, he searched to see if he could find him. And he followed his tracks, and then they just stopped.
There was no tent. He disappeared.
Chris has been picked up on the road outside the cabin by another woman. Someone who Taylor has already met.
My first memory of meeting another woman was going to the Ulster County pool. My dad told me he was going to meet a friend of his from work, and she had a little girl with her too. We remember playing with all of them in the pool. She was a few years younger than me.
Taylor plays with the little girl named Megan on more than one occasion.
We went hiking together one time up in Minnewaska. It was definitely a few times he had me go meet her. He was treating both of us kind of the same. It was bothering me. And she kept calling him Dad.
Tracy's daughter Taylor meets another girl who is calling her father Dad.
He said that she didn't have a father of her own, so he was trying to step into that role for her. And then he would make me pinky swear not to tell my mom anything about what we did.
Taylor told me that her father and her went with this other woman to some falls up by Kingston, New York. And he has her pinky swear not to tell me. And then when I questioned him about it, he just said it was a friend he ran into.
Tracy's a smart person. And I think that somewhere inside, she definitely didn't believe him. But she was so afraid of bringing it to the surface because she didn't want the consequences of what would happen to their marriage.
I was waiting for things to get better. It would get better, it would get better. I hang in there.
I feel like at my bridal shower, my baby shower.
In February of 1998, Taylor celebrates her 7th birthday. By this time, everyone but Tracy seems to be on to Chris.
I think that's the last birthday I remember with my father being there.
We believe that he's living a double life. He is off buying things and telling my husband that he has charge cards that Tracy doesn't know about. And I think he's doing it just to add fuel to all of our fire.
By the time summer arrives, Tracy and Chris have not been intimate for over 4 years.
I thought he was gay for a while. There was a manager at IBM that he kept talking about that was gay, that he hung out with, and also the lack of sex for years. So it was making me think, well, geez, maybe he is gay. I did ask questions, but they were always lies. I was gagging and throwing up. That's how bad I was. Crying. Felt like I didn't have anybody in the world.
In September, at the start of the school year, Chris starts spending time alone in the garage. He tells Tracy that he is working on something special for her.
He said to me, I have a surprise for you. Don't tell your sister about it. And I told her, because I thought it was going to be something romantic.
She just was really excited about it. And I think she felt that it was going to make their marriage better.
I was excited. I couldn't wait for my surprise.
Chris even puts up garbage bags to black out the windows in the garage so that Tracy can't peek.
I heard noises. I don't know exactly what he was doing. We also bought unfinished furniture that he would paint and stain over the years. So it could be something like that. To me, he was working on my surprise. So I didn't want to open the door and ruin it and peek.
Hey, honey.
As the weekend approaches, Chris seems to be more flirtatious.
He picked me up, and I got embarrassed, and I got shy, and I asked him to put me down. He never picked me up before, never. And I was uncomfortable with that because I'm heavy. Within a few hours later, he had me move a ladder. And I thought it was strange that he didn't do it. He had me do it.
That's great. Great.
On the evening of September 12th, 1998, Chris, Tracy, and Taylor arrive home early from a dinner with friends.
He told me about the surprise. He was getting the surprise ready. And I went to the living room while he was out in the garage.
While Taylor sleeps upstairs, Tracy waits in anticipation.
He comes in and gets me and tells me the surprise is ready. He put a blindfold around my eyes, tightened it up.
Chris places an envelope in Tracy's hand.
He told me it was part of the surprise.
She thought maybe it was airline tickets, and she was hoping it was a trip.
And he had to help me out to the garage. I was okay with it because when somebody's going to surprise you, sometimes they do that. They put blindfold on you. He opens the door and then puts me at the first step. So I'm out on the first step. He's behind me. He tells me the surprise is not ready.
Chris leads Tracy back to the couch, removes the blindfold, and she waits again.
He comes back out to the living room and tells me the surprise ready now. He had to do a couple things. So we go through the same routine. Opens the door, helps me down to the first step.
On this way.
It wasn't ready. Again.
No, it's not
We go
ready.
back in. I go right back to the couch.
Finally, the surprise is ready. Chris re-blindfolds Tracy and again places the envelope in her hand.
Now it's just quiet. And I can hear him breathing behind me. Now I'm starting to get suspicious. Now I'm starting to get a little nervous.
He leads her into the garage, and Tracy waits again for what seems like eternity.
My heart was pounding out of my chest. I felt something come down my neck.
Tracy Wygant's husband, Chris, has just slipped a noose over her head.
And my reaction was to hit it off. And I quickly hit the blindfold up off me and looked up, and he was above me, and he had big gloves on. And I saw him holding the rope with a noose. I went into an out of my body experience, like numb. Is this really happening? It could have been a diamond, it could have been pearls, but it wasn't. It was a noose.
She was seconds away from death. Seconds. He was going to pull Tracy up by the noose, and he was going to hold on to it until she was dead.
I looked up, and I said to him, "What's going on?" And he let the noose go, and he went to the corner of the garage. And he was crying. He said that he was in love with another woman, and we have a child.
Tracy doesn't consider that she might still be in danger.
I thought about it more afterwards. Like, how stupid was I thinking that maybe he wouldn't take a gun and shoot me? He could have easily done that. I was shaking at this time, and I said, "I'm going to call my sister."
We were sound asleep, and it was Tracy. She was crying hysterically and wanted me to come up there. Like now. I called my father and asked him to come up to Tracy's. And I said, "It's bad news. I bet it's an affair again." I went to the front door, and Chris opened the door. He looked disheveled, tired. He looked like a monster. I turned and saw Tracy sitting on the couch, and she was rocking, and she was crying. So I knelt down next to her, and I said, "Tracy, what's going on? Tell me what's happening." And she said, "He has another woman and a child. Her name is Megan." And I could tell she was trying to process it. And I turned to look at him, and I said to him, that was your surprise? This is your surprise?
Chris sees Tracy's father coming and leaves to go meet him outside.
That gave me the opportunity to say to Tracy, that was your surprise? And she said, no, he tried to hang me in the garage. At that point, I went into the garage area. The windows were all blackened out with black plastic bags. The ladder was standing there, and there was the news.
She said, Tracy, I have to call the police. I'm begging her not to call the police.
Kelly calls 911.
Everything was definitely surreal that night. Everything seemed to go in slow motion.
Tracy tells Kelly that she asked Chris why he wanted to kill her.
And he said, you made me do this to you. And she said, why? What did I do? What did I do wrong? And he said, you made me do this. You would never let me go. This is bad. This is really bad. I'm very concerned about my sister because I think she's going to have a severe mental breakdown.
Tracy's dad is startled when police arrive on the scene.
And he said, why would you call the police? This is just an affair. And I looked at my father and I said, no, it's not, Dad. He tried to hang her in the garage. At that point, my father just leapt through the air and jumped on Chris. And that's when the police quickly grabbed my father and Chris.
The officers escort Chris into another room.
He was pacing, wringing his hands. He kept apologizing. He says, I wanted to do a double suicide. I wanted to kill my wife and then kill myself. I'm like, no, you know that's not a double suicide. We call it murder-suicide. I said, well, how are you gonna kill yourself? He says, well, I got a gun. He showed me the gun. It was in a closet, all the way back in the closet. I found the .308 that was in there. I'm like, okay, where's the ammo? I don't know. Okay, and how are you going to off yourself with a gun if there's no ammo available? Something's not right.
Chris is arrested, but only for menacing and endangerment.
He had me move the ladder to get my prints on the ladder. Him having me hold the note was going to be a suicide letter. And he picked me up because he wanted to see how he could pull me to hang me. The police say when the surprise wasn't ready that he was trying to get his nerve up. If he did what he was going to do the first time, maybe even the second, he would have succeeded.
Tracy ended up in a psychiatric hospital.
It's like being hit with a double blow. The love of your life has just tried to kill you. You get out of it, and then he hits you with the other blow that kills your heart, it kills your soul.
The next morning, Kelly races to gain emergency custody of Taylor before Chris makes bail. Tracy Wygant spends a week in a psychiatric hospital trying to understand why her husband tried to kill her.
He wanted to look like I committed suicide.
He wanted to look like the victim. Everybody would have been crying for him and feeling bad for him, and he would have came out victorious.
If Chris had succeeded, he would have avoided a custody battle for Taylor.
He would have got the house. He would have got money from the New York State Teachers Union. They would have been set, and they would have lived happily ever after, the four of them in the house. That was his goal.
It was cheaper to pay for a funeral than a divorce lawyer. I believe she saved her own life.
Tracy would never have divorced him. Even after that night, I don't think she wanted to divorce him.
After Tracy returns home from the hospital, she gets full custody of Taylor and then searches the house for evidence of Chris's double life.
I found special holiday cards, letters, fake divorce papers, mail-in divorces.
I'm sure he was showing his girlfriend that he was going through a divorce.
Proof positive that Chris was seeing other women throughout their marriage.
One card I opened up and it was a Valentine's card and it had a voice. Happy, happy hard day. We love you very much. Love, Kathy and Taylor. So it was not good for me. So my family almost had to bring me back to the hospital. That was hard.
There was a photo of Shannon in Disney World, the same time that Tracy, Chris, and Taylor took their Disney World trip. So when he was disappearing, he was meeting Shannon.
February 5th, 1999, 5 months after the attack, a grand jury in Ulster County, New York, upgrades Chris's menacing charge to attempted murder in the second degree.
Usually, the one who is unhappy should be the one that takes a drastic measure. But he wanted to maximize his happiness. He wanted to have everything that they had built together to himself. So she was expendable to him.
Just over a year later, in 2000, they go to trial.
He sat there acting like he did nothing wrong. He was the perfect husband who wanted a divorce. That's it.
He told the jury that he was trying to tell me it was over.
His defense was he was just trying to scare her into a divorce because she never would have left him.
The last time I saw my dad was when we went to court, and it was just for a split second. I was set to testify, give my own statements, and I was halfway through the door, and the judge decided he didn't need my testimony, so I was immediately scooched back and out of the room.
Tracy and Kelly take the stand, but the evidence is airtight.
I was in a little bit of a fighting spirit at that time, but still very timid, still beaten up. It was tough with his lawyer, but I held my own.
What I think went wrong with Chris's plan was that he lost his nerve, but I also think that he could have done it.
By unanimous vote, a jury finds Chris Chanowitz guilty of attempted murder, and he is sentenced to 15 years in prison.
I was looking at him when I read my victim response for the sentencing. He wouldn't let me look at him because it was very heartfelt. I cried. Yeah, I was upset. I cried. I did that for a couple weeks.
Tracy and Taylor sell the house and start rebuilding their lives in a new home.
I am proud of how Tracy came out of this. For the last 25 years, she has built a little life for her and Taylor in this house. She has made it a showstopper. People stop and take pictures. She does gardening outside. And that has been her sanctuary.
After serving 13 years, Chris gets out of jail in 2013 and moves back to Wallkill.
I walk up in my front yard to go do something, and there he drives by. We make eye contact sometimes.
I was in Home Depot. I just happened to go around the corner, and there he was. And I started yelling for security. I said there was an attempted murderer in the store, and security was running. I told him, you better leave. He almost killed my sister. I was screaming at him on top of my lungs, and he left.
Taylor rejects her father for what he did to her mother. And now Tracy is retired from teaching and has found new love.
Steve worked for the town of Newburgh. He was a fireman for over 50 years. He just loves me so much, and I love him. Matter of fact, I'm missing him right now. He's done so much for me. I hit the jackpot.
She finally has found the perfect man for her who wants to take care of her and who truly, truly loves her. I feel like I have my older sister back.
My mom's very funny. She enjoys goofing off, never really acts her age, always singing and dancing around the house, even if it can drive me crazy sometimes.
I'm able to do it because Steve's in my life. And that's given me the strength. And I think God knows now that I have the strength to do that.
It begins with a silence that should not exist, the kind of silence that settles into a house too early in the evening, when the lights are still on, the television is still humming, and someone should be home by now. A silence that feels wrong even before anyone dares to say it out loud, because in the spring of 1997, in a quiet Florida neighborhood lined with palm trees and cracked sidewalks bleached by the sun, people still believed that disappearances belonged to television shows, not to their street, not to their routines, not to the woman whose car was now sitting in the driveway with the driver's door unlocked and the engine cold. Florida, 1997, before smartphones, before location sharing, before the word cold case carried the weight it does today. Back when missing person flyers were printed at copy shops and taped to telephone poles, when investigators relied on handwritten notes, landline calls, and instincts sharpened by repetition rather than data, and on that evening, as dusk slid into darkness, the first call came in, not frantic yet, not screaming, just a voice asking whether anyone had seen her, whether she had maybe stopped by, whether she had called because she always called, always checked in, always followed her patterns until suddenly she didn't. The house smelled like dinner that had gone untouched. The mail lay unopened on the counter. The answering machine blinked with no new messages. And in the bedroom, the bed was still made, tight corners, undisturbed, as if the night had never been planned, as if whoever had left that house had done so expecting to return within minutes. And it was that detail, small and almost invisible, that would later haunt investigators more than any dramatic sign of struggle, because disappearances without chaos are the hardest to explain. By midnight, the word missing was spoken for the first time in an official capacity, written into a report, stamped with a date, Florida 1997, and with that stamp, a life quietly crossed into the space between known and unknown, where answers blur and speculation multiplies, where every hour that passes stretches like elastic, snapping just enough hope to keep people searching but never enough to bring certainty. Neighbors were questioned under flickering porch lights, their memories fuzzy, their timelines uncertain, everyone recalling something slightly different, a car that passed too slowly, footsteps they thought they heard, a voice they couldn't place, details that floated without anchors, because no one had been paying attention, because no one thought they needed to, and by morning, the neighborhood looked the same as it always had, sunlight washing over everything, disguising the absence as if it were temporary, as if the day itself refused to acknowledge what had happened during the night. Police searched the immediate area first, the standard protocol, backyards, nearby lots, dumpsters, drainage ditches swollen with stagnant water, every place where a body might be hidden or a clue discarded. But Florida is a landscape that eats evidence, heat breaking down fibers, humidity warping paper, insects erasing traces before anyone knows they matter, and by the time search teams expanded outward, the environment had already begun its quiet work of erasure. Friends described her as reliable, predictable, not reckless, not someone who vanished without explanation, not someone who started over, not someone who left behind everything without a trace, and investigators circled the same question over and over, writing it in different ways, asking it to different people, but always returning to the same conclusion. She didn't disappear, she was taken. And the difference between those two ideas is where fear begins to take root. Days passed, then weeks, and the case file thickened with statements, maps, timelines, phone records that led nowhere, bank accounts untouched, credit cards silent, a life frozen at the exact moment it fell off the radar. And the media began to notice, a short segment at first, a photograph on the evening news, a name pronounced carefully by anchors who would soon move on to the next story. But for the family, time had stopped completely. Every morning beginning with hope and ending with dread. Florida law enforcement worked the angles they always did. starting close and widening out, partners, exes, co-workers, acquaintances, anyone whose name intersected with hers in the weeks before she vanished. But suspicion without evidence is a dead end, and every lead dissolved under scrutiny, alibis checked out, timelines held, no one cracked, no one slipped, and as the months stretched on, the word cold case hovered just outside the frame, not yet spoken but already looming. What made the case unsettling wasn't what investigators found, but what they didn't: no blood, no weapon, no witnesses who could point to a moment of violence, just a sudden, clean break from routine, as if someone had pressed pause on a life mid-sentence. And it was this absence that fed rumors, whispers that moved faster than facts, theories traded over kitchen tables and bar counters, some believing she ran, others believing something darker had happened, everyone filling the silence with their own version of the unknown. By the end of the first year, the case had stalled, not officially closed, but quietly pushed to the side as newer crimes demanded attention. And that's how cold cases are born, not with a declaration but with neglect, with files moved to lower shelves, with detectives reassigned, with families learning the sound of the word unfortunately. And in Florida, 1997 slipped into 1998, then 1999, the world changing while one question remained exactly the same. Every anniversary brought a spike in activity, renewed searches, fresh interviews, media callbacks, but nothing ever stuck. And the neighborhood that once felt safe now carried a permanent shadow, parents locking doors earlier, routines shifting, trust eroding in small, invisible ways, because unsolved crimes don't just haunt families, they infect entire communities, reminding everyone that certainty is an illusion. Years passed, technology advanced, DNA databases grew, old evidence was re-examined, but there was so little to test, so little preserved, that each new promise of a breakthrough faded into disappointment, and the case became a reference point, a cautionary tale, a file number whispered among detectives. Florida, 1997, the one that never gave anything back. And then, quietly, without warning, without press releases or renewed searches, something changed, not in the past but in the present, a shift so small it would have gone unnoticed if not for what it eventually uncovered. Because decades after the disappearance, on an ordinary day, during a routine traffic stop, the past would resurface in the most unexpected way, dragging a cold case out of the dark and back into the light, ready to demand answers it had been denied for over 20 years. The case never truly died, it just went quiet, buried beneath newer files and louder crimes. But in the evidence room of the county sheriff's office, Florida heat humming outside concrete walls, a cardboard box still sat on a metal shelf, yellow tape curling at the edges, a handwritten label fading but legible enough to be recognized by anyone who had worked the case long enough to feel its weight, because cold cases don't disappear, they wait. And this one waited patiently while the world moved on. In the late 90s, investigators were working blind compared to what would come later. No instant DNA matches, no national databases large enough to pull a stranger out of anonymity, just lab tests that took months and returned with nothing definitive. And the few physical items recovered from the early search were treated with care but limited understanding, bagged, tagged, stored away with the quiet hope that science might someday catch up to the questions they carried. Back then, detectives focused on routine because routine is where violence hides most easily, retracing her final day step by step, the grocery store receipt time-stamped in the afternoon, the gas station clerk who vaguely remembered her face but nothing unusual, the neighbor who thought they heard a car door slam sometime after sunset but couldn't swear to it, all of it forming a timeline that ended abruptly and without explanation, like a sentence cut off mid-word. They mapped her social circle carefully, co-workers first, interviews conducted in small offices that smelled of stale coffee and paper, questions asked calmly, methodically, watching for hesitation, for contradictions, for anything that might crack under pressure. But everyone checked out, no grudges, no threats, no obvious motive, and as the days turned into weeks, the circle widened, ex-boyfriends pulled back into the present, casual acquaintances suddenly under scrutiny, even distant relatives questioned with the uncomfortable implication that familiarity breeds opportunity. Nothing stuck, and that absence of a suspect became its own kind of evidence, forcing investigators to confront a harder possibility, that whoever was responsible didn't belong to her inner world at all, that this wasn't personal, that it was random, opportunistic, a crime of circumstance rather than passion, and that idea unsettled everyone involved because random violence doesn't leave patterns, it leaves fear. Search efforts intensified, helicopters scanning tree lines, volunteers combing fields under the relentless Florida sun, Sweat soaking through shirts, eyes burning from salt and light, hope thinning with every hour that passed without discovery. And still nothing surfaced. No discarded belongings, no shallow grave, no indication of where the trail had gone cold, just miles of landscape swallowing the truth whole. The media coverage grew sharper, the word cold case creeping closer to the headlines, reporters asking questions that investigators couldn't answer, families forced to repeat the same details on camera, reliving the disappearance over and over in sound bites and photographs, each interview a reminder that visibility was both necessary and painful, that attention could help but also exhaust, draining energy that had already been stretched thin. Privately, detectives argued over theories, some convinced she had encountered someone she trusted, others leaning toward a stranger, a predator passing through, a momentary intersection of paths that turned fatal. But without evidence, theories are just noise, and noise doesn't hold up in court, so the file grew thicker while certainty remained just out of reach. By the early 2000s, the case had officially cooled, not closed, just dormant, waiting for something new, and that waiting reshaped everyone connected to it. Parents aged visibly, birthdays passed without celebration, holidays carried an empty chair that no one dared to fill, and for investigators, the case became a quiet failure they carried with them, a reminder that not every story ends neatly, that justice sometimes stalls without explanation. Technology advanced, and with it came renewed interest, old evidence pulled from storage, envelopes opened under fluorescent lights, gloves snapping on wrists, lab technicians carefully extracting what little remained from items that had survived decades in controlled darkness, fibers degraded, biological traces faint but present, enough to test, not enough to promise anything. And when the results came back inconclusive once again, hope receded but did not vanish entirely. Time has a way of changing perception, of transforming immediate tragedy into long-term mystery, and in the community, the disappearance became part of local lore, whispered to newcomers, referenced in conversations about safety, about trust, about how quickly normal can unravel, and yet, as years piled on, fewer people remembered the details clearly, faces blurred, dates mixed up, until the case existed more as a feeling than a set of facts, a lingering unease without a clear origin. Inside law enforcement, however, the file was never forgotten, revisited periodically by fresh eyes, new detectives flipping through old reports, seeing patterns others might have missed, questioning assumptions made decades earlier, but every review ended the same way, with unanswered questions and the same haunting conclusion, that whatever happened that night in 1997 had been executed cleanly enough to erase itself from the record. And then, far from the original scene, miles away from the quiet street where it all began, a man lived an ordinary life, blending into the background, working, driving, aging, accumulating nothing that would draw attention, his name never crossing the radar of the investigators who once chased every lead with urgency, because sometimes the most dangerous secrets travel unnoticed for years, carried by people who understand that invisibility is protection. The case remained frozen in time until fate intervened, not through a breakthrough in technology or a confession born of guilt, but through chance, the kind of chance that law enforcement relies on more than it ever admits publicly, because one ordinary decision, one routine action, one brief interaction on the side of a road, would eventually reach backward through decades, connecting the present to a night long buried, and when that connection formed, it would change everything the case had been waiting to become. The turning point didn't announce itself, didn't arrive with flashing lights or breaking news banners, it slipped in quietly, disguised as routine, because that's how the past prefers to return, not with drama, but with coincidence. And years after Florida 1997 had faded into the background of departmental memory, a patrol officer stood on the shoulder of a highway, heat rippling off the asphalt, hand resting casually on a duty belt, watching traffic crawl past in slow, indifferent lines. It was a standard stop, the kind officers barely remember by the end of their shift, a minor violation, a broken tail light, maybe speeding by a few miles an hour, nothing that suggested danger, nothing that hinted at history, just paperwork, identification, a few questions exchanged through an open window while engines idled and insects buzzed in the air. And yet, something about the driver didn't sit right. Not enough to articulate, just enough to linger. The name on the license meant nothing at first, no red flags, no outstanding warrants, no alerts flashing on the screen, a clean surface that invited no suspicion, but experience teaches officers to trust patterns as much as databases, and the way the man avoided eye contact, The way his answers came a fraction too rehearsed, too smooth, registered subconsciously, filed away as a note rather than a conclusion. The stop ended like thousands before it, a warning issued, a reminder given, the driver pulling back onto the road, disappearing into traffic, and for most people involved, that would have been the end of it, a forgettable interaction on a forgettable afternoon. Except the officer didn't forget, not entirely, and later, back in the patrol car, paperwork stacked on the dash, something about the name tugged at memory. It wasn't recognition, not exactly, more like alignment, a mental click between unrelated fragments, a last name seen somewhere else, perhaps in an old report, perhaps in a briefing years ago. A whisper of familiarity that refused to settle, and that whisper followed the officer into the station, into the quiet hours when shifts change and conversations slow. Curiosity in law enforcement can be dangerous, but it can also be the engine that drives cases forward. And that night, curiosity won. The officer typing the name into a system not designed for hunches, cross-referencing old databases, scrolling through archived records, the glow of the monitor reflecting off tired eyes as decades collapsed into lines of text. The connection wasn't obvious, not a direct hit, not a clear match, just a proximity, a coincidence of geography, a residence once near the disappearance site, a timeline that overlapped in ways too neat to ignore, and suddenly Florida 1997 wasn't just a file number anymore. It was breathing again, stirring in the back rooms of the department where cold cases are stored like unfinished sentences. Supervisors were notified cautiously. No one wanted to inflate a traffic stop into a breakthrough without substance, but the name was forwarded, flagged for review by detectives who had either inherited the case or grown up hearing about it, men and women who understood how fragile these moments are, how easily hope can outrun evidence. The file came off the shelf again, dust shaken loose, pages spread across a conference table under harsh lighting, fingers tracing timelines, revisiting witness statements long dismissed as inconclusive, and suddenly, details that once felt irrelevant began to glow faintly, addresses matching, routines aligning, a presence near the area that had never been fully examined because at the time, there was nothing to examine. Background checks expanded, pulling in employment records, vehicle histories, old addresses, every movement mapped backward through time, and while nothing screamed guilt, the absence of contradiction was itself unsettling. No airtight alibi placing the man far away, no proof that he couldn't have been there, just a long stretch of unaccounted for hours on the night everything went wrong. Investigators moved carefully, aware that decades-old cases collapse under aggressive handling, witnesses forget, memories distort, and suspects grow comfortable in the assumption that time has protected them. So they started with subtlety, casual inquiries framed as routine updates, knocking on doors, making phone calls, watching reactions more than listening to words. People remembered him vaguely, a quiet guy, kept to himself, nothing remarkable, the kind of person who blends into any environment, the kind of person no one notices until they're asked to remember. And even then, recollections were thin, impressions rather than facts, but what stood out was consistency, the same description repeated across interviews, unassuming, unmemorable, invisible. The man himself was contacted eventually, approached under the guise of clearing old records, his demeanor calm, cooperative, agreeable to conversation, answering questions without resistance, but detectives noted the tension beneath the surface, the careful phrasing, the way his story stayed just vague enough to avoid contradiction, as if he understood the value of saying little without appearing evasive. No confession came, no slip of the tongue, and without new physical evidence, the case hovered once again on the edge of progress, threatening to sink back into dormancy, until lab results returned from a separate review of stored materials, a re-examination ordered almost as an afterthought, because when a case has waited this long, every possibility is worth exhausting. The results were incomplete but promising, a partial profile, fragments of biological material that had survived time and mishandling, not enough to identify a person outright, but enough to compare, enough to ask new questions, and suddenly the traffic stop wasn't just a coincidence anymore, it was a doorway, narrow but open. Legal procedures moved slowly, warrants drafted with care, justifications stacked meticulously, because the difference between closure and collapse lies in paperwork as much as proof. And as detectives prepared their next move, they understood that they were standing at a rare intersection, where chance, patience, and persistence briefly align. Somewhere, the man continued his life, unaware of the machinery beginning to turn around him, unaware that a routine stop had pulled him out of anonymity, unaware that Florida 1997 had started to remember him, And when the knock finally came, it would not be loud, not violent, just firm, inevitable, carrying with it the weight of years that refused to stay buried. The knock didn't come at night, didn't arrive with urgency or raised voices. It came in daylight, measured, professional, the kind of knock that carries authority without drama, because by the time detectives stood at his door, they had already decided that subtlety was their strongest weapon, that pressure applied too early could fracture a case that had waited decades for the right moment. He answered calmly, almost casually, the door opening onto an ordinary interior, neutral colors, clean surfaces, no visible signs of chaos or secrecy, a life arranged to look exactly like what it was supposed to be. And when detectives introduced themselves, explained they were reviewing an old matter, his expression barely shifted, just a brief pause, a flicker so small it could have been missed by anyone not trained to look for it. They spoke carefully, framing questions as administrative, routine, updating records, the language of bureaucracy masking the true weight of their intent, and he responded in kind, polite, cooperative, offering coffee, answering without protest, the kind of compliance that can be reassuring or deeply unsettling, depending on what you expect to find. As the conversation moved forward, detectives watched his body more than his words, the way he leaned back slightly when dates were mentioned, the way his hands folded and unfolded when locations came up, subtle tells that suggested memory working overtime, not to recall, but to calculate, to edit, to maintain consistency across decades of silence. They left without incident, thanking him for his time, promising to be in touch, and as the door closed, the house returned to stillness, but outside, the investigation accelerated, paperwork flowing through offices, requests filed, supervisors briefed, because while nothing he said could be used against him directly, what he didn't say was beginning to matter. Search warrants followed, not immediately, but methodically, tied to probable cause built from proximity, timelines, and the newly rediscovered biological fragments, and when approval came through, it marked the first time in over 20 years that the case had crossed from speculation into action. The search was thorough, controlled, executed with the quiet precision of people who understand how fragile old cases are. Drawers opened, boxes examined, vehicles inspected inch by inch, soil samples collected from places no one had thought to check before, and while nothing dramatic emerged, no hidden trophies, no written confessions, investigators found enough inconsistencies to keep digging. Old vehicles were traced, registration records pulled from archives, maintenance logs examined for unexplained repairs, and slowly, a pattern began to form, not a narrative yet, but a shape, a sense that the night in 1997 had not been as empty as it once seemed, that someone had moved through it deliberately, leaving behind only the faintest traces. Witnesses were revisited, some reluctantly, some with a sense of grim curiosity, people now older, lives reshaped by time, memories dulled but not erased, and when shown photographs again, when asked to think back to that year, some recalled details they hadn't trusted themselves to share before, a car parked where it didn't belong, a man standing alone too long, a feeling that something was off but unprovable. Each recollection was fragile, subject to distortion, but together they added weight, reinforcing the idea that the disappearance had not been spontaneous, that it had unfolded within a narrow window, that opportunity and intent had intersected briefly and decisively, leaving behind a vacuum where answers should have been. The lab work continued in parallel, technicians working with what little remained, coaxing information out of degraded samples, aware that this might be their only chance, that contamination, time, or simple bad luck could erase the final thread connecting evidence to identity. And when the results came back stronger than expected, not definitive but clearer, the room went quiet. A comparison was now possible, a legal path open to request a sample, and with it the tension shifted because this was the point where cases either break open or collapse under scrutiny, where one refusal, one legal misstep can undo years of patient work. Detectives returned, this time with purpose, explaining the request plainly, watching his reaction closely, and for the first time the calm wavered, not dramatically, not enough to draw attention in another context, but enough to register, enough to confirm that the pressure was finally reaching something buried deep. He hesitated, asked questions, requested time, exercised his rights, all legally sound, all expected, but the refusal itself became part of the story, another piece to be weighed alongside everything else, and as legal teams prepared for the next phase, the case tightened around him like a net slowly drawn closed. Outside, the world remained unaware. No headlines yet, no announcements, just quiet movement within offices and courtrooms, because law enforcement understands that anticipation can be as dangerous as silence. that revealing too much too soon invites scrutiny before certainty. The file, once dormant, now lived on desks again, annotated, cross-referenced, every page re-examined under the harsh light of possibility, and for those who had carried the case for years, this moment felt unreal, as if the past had finally decided to answer back. Somewhere in the city, the man continued his routines, driving familiar roads, stopping at familiar places, aware now that something had shifted, that the distance he had relied on for protection was shrinking, and as investigators prepared to move forward, they understood that the next step would force the truth into the open, whether it was ready or not. The waiting was deliberate, calculated, a pause designed to let the pressure do its work, because investigators know that silence can be louder than interrogation, that when nothing happens on the surface, anxiety fills the space beneath, and during that quiet stretch, legal motions advanced, warrants refined, lab requests prioritized, every step measured against the risk of tipping the balance too early. When the order finally came through, it arrived without ceremony, a document stamped and signed, granting permission to collect what the case had been denied for more than 2 decades, a direct comparison, a chance to let science speak where witnesses could not, and with that authorization, the investigation crossed into territory from which there was no retreat. The approach was controlled, procedural, designed to appear routine because routine disarms, and when officers explained the process, outlined the legal basis, emphasized that cooperation would expedite everything, the tension in the room thickened, the air heavy with words left unsaid, because everyone understood what was at stake, that this was no longer about revisiting history, but about rewriting it. The sample was collected carefully, sealed, logged, transferred under strict chain of custody protocols, each step documented, witnessed, signed, because in cold cases, evidence doesn't just need to exist, it needs to survive scrutiny, and as the envelope disappeared into the system, decades collapsed into a single question waiting for an answer. Back at the lab, technicians worked with focus sharpened by rarity, knowing that opportunities like this don't come often, that degraded profiles rarely get a second chance, and as machines hummed and data resolved into patterns, numbers aligning and diverging, the past began to organize itself into something recognizable. The result didn't arrive instantly, no dramatic pause, no flashing alert, just a report, precise, unemotional, stating probabilities, margins, statistical significance, and then, unmistakably, a match, not partial, not ambiguous, but strong enough to close gaps that had remained open for years, strong enough to transform suspicion into certainty. The room where detectives read the report went quiet, not with celebration, but with gravity, because this moment carried weight far beyond its technical language. It meant that the absence that had haunted the case now had an anchor, that the night in 1997 had finally left behind a voice loud enough to be heard. Procedures shifted immediately, timelines tightened, arrest plans drafted with care, because unlike fresh cases driven by urgency, cold cases demand restraint, the understanding that every move will be examined not just by courts, but by history, by families who have waited too long for answers to accept anything less than thoroughness. Surveillance increased subtly, not to provoke, but to observe, patterns confirmed, routines mapped, ensuring that when the moment came it would unfold cleanly, without escalation, without risk to bystanders, because justice delayed does not excuse recklessness. Inside the suspect's world, changes were subtle but visible, a tightening of habits, glances held a moment too long, movements measured, as if he sensed the net drawing in, as if the routine that had protected him for years was beginning to betray him, and that awareness, that internal shift, was something investigators watched closely. When the arrest finally happened, it wasn't cinematic, no chase, no resistance, just a quiet interruption to an ordinary day. Hands guided behind a back. Rights read aloud. A life paused as decisively as the one that had vanished decades earlier. And in that moment, Florida 1997 stepped out of abstraction and into reality. News of the arrest spread quickly once it broke, headlines flashing words like cold case solved and shocking arrest. Communities stunned by the idea that something so old could still reach forward and claim accountability, but behind the spectacle there was restraint, officials careful not to overpromise, aware that resolution in the public eye does not always align with resolution in court. For the family, notification came privately, a conversation that balanced relief and grief in equal measure, because answers don't restore time, they redefine it, forcing memories to reorganize around new truths, and as names were spoken aloud for the first time in years, the weight of knowing settled in. The suspect was processed, booked, questioned, his earlier calm replaced by a guarded silence, Attorneys stepping in, statements narrowing, the dance between prosecution and defense beginning in earnest, because even with a match, even with evidence, the path from arrest to conviction is never guaranteed. As court dates were set and preparations began, investigators returned once more to the file, reviewing everything through the lens of certainty, seeing how fragments that once felt disconnected now aligned, how chance and choice had intersected on that night, and how patience more than brilliance had finally brought the case to this threshold. The story once defined by absence now carried substance, but resolution was still incomplete, because justice is not declared at arrest, it is tested, challenged, argued over in rooms far removed from the quiet street where the silence began, and as Florida watched, the cold case moved into its most fragile phase yet, where truth must survive not just time but judgment. The courtroom didn't feel like a place of revelation at first, it felt sterile, controlled, stripped of emotion by design, because justice prefers neutrality even when the story it contains is anything but neutral, and as proceedings began, Florida 1997 re-entered public consciousness not as a mystery whispered in hallways, but as a case number read aloud, formal, exact, unforgiving. Prosecutors moved carefully, aware that time had both strengthened and weakened their position, strengthened it through science, weakened it through memory, because juries understand DNA but struggle with decades-old timelines, and the strategy reflected that reality, anchoring everything to what could be proven, not what could be felt. They opened with the disappearance itself, not dramatized, not embellished, just a sequence of facts laid end to end, the last confirmed sighting, the unanswered calls, the abandoned routine, allowing the silence of those gaps to speak for itself, because absence, when framed correctly, can be as compelling as action. Defense counsel responded with equal precision, not denying the tragedy, but questioning its interpretation, reminding the court that cold cases are vulnerable to distortion, that evidence degrades, that assumptions calcify over time, and that coincidence, no matter how unsettling, is not proof, their words designed to plant doubt without appearing dismissive. Witnesses took the stand one by one, voices steady but aged, recounting moments they hadn't revisited in years, the grocery store clerk recalling a face without details, a neighbor describing a sound they never fully trusted, each testimony carrying the weight of uncertainty, and yet, together, they painted a landscape of that evening, incomplete but recognizable. Experts followed, lab technicians explaining processes in plain language, translating complex science into narratives jurors could follow, emphasizing chain of custody, contamination controls, statistical significance, and when the DNA match was presented, it landed not as a dramatic reveal, but as a measured conclusion, the product of method rather than miracle. The defense challenged relentlessly, probing margins of error, questioning collection methods from the 90s, suggesting alternative explanations, the possibility of transfer, contamination, coincidence, anything that could fracture certainty into pieces small enough to be ignored, because their task wasn't to explain what happened, only to argue that no one could be sure. The accused sat quietly through it all, expression guarded, posture composed, a study in restraint, occasionally whispering to counsel, occasionally scanning the room, his presence a reminder that behind every cold case file is a living person whose life now hangs in balance, just as another life once did. Outside the courtroom, the community watched, old wounds reopened, conversations resurfacing, people reassessing memories they thought they had settled long ago, because unresolved crimes don't stay confined to records, they linger in shared consciousness, and this trial forced everyone to confront the fact that the past was never really past. Midway through proceedings, a subtle shift occurred, not a single moment, but an accumulation, jurors leaning forward more often, questions growing sharper, the narrative tightening as disparate elements began to align, and prosecutors sensed it, adjusting emphasis, reinforcing connections, letting the story cohere naturally rather than forcing it into shape. Defense motions followed, requests to suppress, to exclude, to delay, procedural maneuvers designed to slow momentum, because in court, time is a weapon and every pause introduces the possibility of doubt, but the judge ruled narrowly, keeping the focus where it belonged on evidence that could withstand scrutiny. Closing arguments approached with inevitability, both sides aware that persuasion now mattered more than proof, that interpretation would decide what facts alone could not, and as attorneys spoke, they returned again and again to the same questions: what does it mean to know, how much certainty is enough, and who bears the cost when answers arrive too late? The jury was sent to deliberate, doors closing softly behind them, leaving the courtroom suspended in anticipation, families clutching hands, investigators sitting still for once, years of effort distilled into a waiting period measured in hours rather than decades, and that waiting felt heavier than anything that had come before. When the verdict finally returned, it did so without flourish, a decision spoken plainly, the culmination of science, testimony, patience, and chance, and regardless of outcome, the moment marked a turning point because the case was no longer a question, it was an answer, contested or confirmed but no longer silent. For those who had lived with the uncertainty, the verdict didn't erase loss, didn't restore what was taken, but it did something quieter and equally profound. It replaced speculation with truth, rumor with record. And as the courtroom emptied, Florida 1997 exhaled, the cold case no longer frozen but transformed. Yet even as one chapter closed, another lingered unresolved because justice addresses responsibility, not absence, and outside, beyond the walls of law, the deeper questions remained about why it happened, about how it went unnoticed, about what might have changed if chance had intervened sooner, questions that would follow the community long after the gavel fell. The verdict didn't land like a clean ending, it landed like a door closing in a house that still echoes, because in a cold case, the moment the world says solved, is the moment the people inside it realize how much can never be repaired. And in Florida, the day after the headlines, the community woke up to the same sun, the same palm shadow stretching across the street, the same traffic humming past strip malls and school zones, but with a new weight pressed into the ordinary, a sentence added to every conversation even when no one wanted to speak it out loud. It was real, it happened here, and it was closer than anyone admitted. Cold case solved. The phrase looked sharp on screen, perfect for a banner, perfect for a push notification, the kind that people read while waiting in line and then forget, except no one in this town could forget, because the words didn't just describe an investigation, they described a crack in the idea of safety that had been sealed over for years with routine and denial, and now that seal was broken again. And everyone remembered where they were when the disappearance first hit the news, remembered the flyers, the candlelight vigils, the uneasy nights when the sound of a car slowing down felt like a threat. For the family, closure arrived with edges, not smooth, not comforting, because closure is a word people use when they don't know what else to offer. And what the family received wasn't closure, it was confirmation. It was a final shape given to a void that had consumed decades. It was the end of imagining alternate outcomes, the end of leaving a porch light on as symbolism, the end of a private ritual of hope that had kept them moving even when it hurt. And the confirmation came with a cost. It forced them to accept that time had passed without mercy, that birthdays had come and gone, that the world had aged while their loved one remained frozen in that last known moment. In the days following, reporters circled again, microphones raised, cameras angled to catch grief without naming it, asking how it feels, what it means, whether justice has been served, and the questions sounded mechanical against the rawness of real life, because what does it mean to win a case that has already stolen decades from you? What does it mean to solve a mystery when the missing years cannot be returned, when the person at the center of the story is still absent in every room, where they should have been? Neighbors reacted the way communities always react when old fear is resurrected, with certainty that they had known, with claims that something always felt off, with stories suddenly sharpened by hindsight, because hindsight is a drug. It turns ambiguity into prophecy, it turns unease into evidence, and people began to tell each other that they remembered him, that they remembered his car, that they remembered the way he looked at them, the way he stood too long at the edge of a driveway. Details that may have been real or may have been stitched into memory by the need to feel less powerless. The most dangerous thing about a solved cold case is that it doesn't just reveal a perpetrator, it reveals how blind a community can be to what is right in front of it. And that realization spreads quietly, infecting trust, because if someone could live among them for years, pay bills, wave hello, blend into local life, what does that say about the assumptions people make every day, the assumptions that keep them calm, the assumptions that let them sleep? Parents spoke differently to their children now, not with the vague warnings of the 90s, but with sharper language, specific rules, a tone shaped by reality rather than cautionary tales, and teenagers who had grown up hearing the story like folklore now saw it with new eyes. Not as something distant, but as a reminder that the past can reach forward and grab you by the collar when you least expect it, that routine traffic stop can become shocking arrest, that an ordinary day can flip into a headline in seconds. Detectives who had inherited the case felt a complex relief, the kind that doesn't look like celebration, because law enforcement isn't built to process decades of unresolved grief, it's built to move forward, to file, to close, to proceed. And yet here they were, living through the long-delayed conclusion of a case they had once believed might never move again. And in the quiet after the trial, some of them returned to their desks and stared at the remaining stacks of unsolved files with a new kind of tension, because one solved case doesn't erase the others. It just proves that time is not an excuse, that waiting is not the same as surrender, and that somewhere in some box another answer might be sleeping. The phrase routine traffic stop became a strange symbol in the town, repeated in conversations like a mantra, because it suggested something unsettling, that justice didn't arrive through perfect investigation, it arrived through chance, through a momentary decision by an officer to pay attention, to look again, to follow a thread that could have been dismissed as nothing, and that randomness made people uncomfortable, because people want to believe the system is precise, controlled, inevitable, but the truth is messier, and the truth is that sometimes a case turns because someone had a feeling on the side of the road. The suspect's arrest also split the community in a way no one expected, not dramatically, not with riots or screaming matches, but with quiet divisions, people taking positions based on what they needed to believe, some insisting science doesn't lie, others clinging to the idea that you can't trust anything that surfaces decades later. And those arguments weren't really about evidence, they were about fear, because accepting the verdict meant accepting that the world is vulnerable, that time does not protect you, that evil can be ordinary, while rejecting it offered a temporary illusion of control. In private homes, the conversations became more personal, spouses asking each other what they would do, what they would notice, whether they would have seen the signs, and these questions carried a hidden accusation. Could we have prevented it? Could we have stopped it? Could we have known? And the truth that no one wanted to say was simple and brutal. Maybe not, because predators don't rely on strength alone, they rely on gaps in attention, gaps in routine, the moments when a community assumes it is safe enough to stop looking. For the family, grief shifted shape because uncertainty is its own kind of pain, but certainty can be worse in a different way. It removes the last thin layer of possibility, and with that layer gone, mourning becomes permanent, no longer postponed by hope, and the family's world began to reorganize around facts they had been denied for decades. A reorganization that felt like betrayal because it demanded they let go of a story they had told themselves in order to survive. They revisited places they had avoided, streets that had become symbolic, locations that carried too much emotion to face, and some did it publicly, some privately, but all of it had the same purpose: to reclaim time, to prove to themselves that they were still here, still standing, still able to move through the world even with the weight of what had happened pressing against their backs. Meanwhile, the town's relationship with the case changed again, from mystery to memory, and memory is slippery, it fades, it morphs, it becomes something people reference without fully understanding, and that terrified the family more than anything, the idea that once the headlines moved on, the story would shrink again, the victim would become a footnote in someone else's narrative, and so they spoke, they insisted on her name, her life, her voice, pushing back against the tendency of true crime to turn people into symbols rather than humans. Online, strangers dissected everything, as strangers always do, timelines turned into threads, courtroom moments clipped into short videos, speculation recycled as analysis, and the family watched helplessly as the most personal tragedy of their lives became content for people who had never set foot in Florida, never seen the street where the silence began, never smelled the air heavy with humidity and dread, and yet spoke with certainty as if the story belonged to them. There is a particular cruelty in a cold case being solved in the era of constant consumption, because the line between empathy and entertainment blurs, and the community learned that even justice can be turned into spectacle, even grief can be processed like a product, and still, despite that discomfort, there was also a strange comfort in knowing the world hadn't forgotten entirely, that people outside the town cared enough to pay attention, even if their attention was imperfect. In the months after, small rituals formed, unofficial, quiet, people leaving flowers at a place that had no official marker, people lighting candles not for the verdict but for the years lost, because the case wasn't just about the arrest, it was about the long stretch of time when no one knew, the stretch that turned childhoods into adulthood, turned parents into grandparents, turned a community into something more cautious, more watchful, more aware of how quickly normal can be stolen. And yet, even with the word solved stamped across the story, something remained unresolved beneath the surface, because a solved case does not always answer every question. It answers the legal one, the identity, the responsibility, but it doesn't always explain the why in a way that satisfies, it doesn't always reveal the full chain of events with cinematic clarity, and people continue to ask what really happened in those missing hours, What she saw, what she thought, whether she realized what was unfolding. Questions that the court could not address without turning grief into detail. Questions that would remain as shadows in the corners of the town's memory. The community learned slowly that justice is not the same thing as peace, that a conviction is not a cure, that solving a cold case is like turning on a light in a room that has been dark for decades. You can finally see, but seeing doesn't erase what's inside. It just makes it impossible to pretend the room was empty, and Florida, once again, had to live with the knowledge of what had been there all along. Even after the verdict, even after the headlines declared victory in bold, confident letters, the case refused to settle into a neat shape, because the public story and the private truth are rarely the same thing, and what the courtroom delivered was a legal conclusion, not a complete map of the night that started it all. And in Florida, people discovered something they were never taught to expect. A cold case can be solved and still feel unfinished, like a door locked with the key missing. It begins with the simplest question, the one that sounds almost childish until you try to answer it honestly: what happened exactly? And the moment you ask it, you realize how much of that night is still blank space, how many hours are represented only by assumptions, how many decisions, movements, moments are lost forever because no one saw them, no camera recorded them. No witness understood what they were looking at until years later, when looking back became an act of desperation. Investigators can prove contact, can prove connection, can build a chain strong enough for conviction, but the missing pieces of experience remain out of reach, and those pieces matter to the people who lived through the uncertainty, because in their minds the story never stopped playing, it just replayed in different versions, each one a little more painful than the last, each one attempting to fill the gaps with something that could be understood, something that could be held, something that made sense. The community kept asking, where did it start? The real start, not the last confirmed sighting on paper, but the first point of danger, the first moment when the ordinary day tilted into something else, because everyone wants a warning sign, a moment they can point to and say, that's where it went wrong, that's the thing we should have noticed, because if you can identify the moment, you can pretend you can prevent it. But the tragedy of these cases is that the moment often looks exactly like nothing. A conversation that seems harmless. A door that opens because it always has. A short distance traveled because it feels safe. A routine so familiar it becomes invisible. That's what haunted people after the trial. Not the dramatic scenes they imagined for years, but the possibility that the trigger was small, quiet, easy to miss. That the difference between safety and danger was measured in seconds and ordinary decisions. And then there was the question of motive, the question the legal system rarely answers in a way that satisfies, because motive is messy, motive lives in psychology and impulse and private history, and prosecutors don't need motive if they have evidence, but families need it, communities need it, because without motive the crime feels random, and if it feels random, then anyone could be next, and if anyone could be next, then the world becomes impossible to relax inside. People dug into the suspect's past like archaeologists searching for a fossil that would explain everything: old jobs, old addresses, old relationships, looking for patterns, for warning signs, for a history that would make his involvement feel inevitable rather than shocking. But the deeper they looked, the more they encountered the most terrifying kind of normal. A life with routines and bills and weekends and mundane habits that offered no obvious confession to the world. That normality became its own scandal because it suggested something that people hate to accept. Monsters don't always look like monsters, sometimes they look like the guy in line behind you, sometimes they look like the person who nods politely and keeps walking, and that realization made neighbors scan their own streets differently, made them wonder what else they had missed, what else was hiding behind polite faces and closed doors. Inside law enforcement, questions remain too, not just about the suspect but about the investigation itself, because every cold case solved is also a cold case revisited. And revisiting means confronting the decisions made in the first days, the interviews that weren't done, the areas not searched thoroughly enough, the tips that were filed and forgotten, not from laziness but from limitation, from time, from lack of resources, from the simple fact that in 1997, the world could not process evidence the way it can now. There were whispers, always whispers, about what might have happened if the technology had existed sooner, if the database had been larger, if someone had connected the name earlier, if a single detail in a witness statement had been treated differently. And those whispers were dangerous because they can turn grief into blame, and blame into bitterness, and bitterness into a second kind of wound that never heals. The family, meanwhile, carried a different set of unanswered questions, the kind that don't belong to a jury, the kind that belong to late nights and empty chairs and the quiet moments when grief stops performing and becomes real again, because even with a conviction they still didn't have what they wanted most. time, and the sense that the story had been fully told. They asked about the missing hours not to sensationalize them, not to turn tragedy into detail, but because those hours contain the last part of her life, and when someone is taken from you, you cling to every fragment. You want to know what she saw, what she felt, whether she had any chance to be heard, whether she fought to be remembered, whether she understood how many people would spend years searching for her in the spaces where she was not. And there's another question, quieter but heavier than the rest, one that settles into families like dust. Did she know she would never come back? Because that is the kind of thought that can poison the mind, and families don't ask it because they want a brutal answer. They ask it because the mind will ask it anyway in the dark on its own, and it's better to confront it than to let it grow wild. For the town, the unresolved questions formed a shadow narrative alongside the official one, a parallel story made of maybes and what-ifs, and those maybes changed the way people talked about safety, about trust, about routine, because once a cold case is solved, it doesn't erase fear, it reframes it. It says the danger was real, and it lasted longer than you realized. It lived in the same years you were raising kids, going to work, laughing at barbecues, and that awareness makes the past feel contaminated. The media fed that hunger for completeness, of course it did, because mystery is a machine and it never stops turning, and commentators speculated, armchair detectives drew maps, podcasts dissected timelines, and every retelling squeezed the story into a shape that fit an audience's attention span, smoothing out the complicated parts, simplifying the human parts, turning the case into a narrative with an arc, a beginning, a middle, and an end. But the family knew better, because their story didn't have an end, it had a verdict. And in the middle of all that noise, the phrase routine traffic stop kept resurfacing like a needle catching on fabric, because it suggested that the universe had chosen an almost absurd method for delivering justice, as if the case had been waiting not for the perfect detective, not for the perfect clue, but for a moment of ordinary law enforcement to collide with an old name at the exact right time. And that randomness made people stare at their own days differently, wondering which ordinary moment might secretly be extraordinary. Even the officers involved carried unanswered questions, because solving a case this old forces you to reconcile two versions of yourself: the younger investigator who once chased the case and failed, and the present one who finally held the evidence that mattered. And that reconciliation is not comfortable. It doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like standing over a timeline and seeing your own life woven into the years of someone else's loss. The case also left behind a brutal lesson. Time does not make a wound smaller, it only makes it familiar, and familiarity can look like healing from a distance, but up close it's just survival. And when the cold case warmed again, it reignited feelings people thought they had learned to control, bringing back old nightmares, old anxieties, old protective instincts that had never truly disappeared. There were moments, too, when hope returned in an unexpected form. Not hope for reversal, not hope for miracles, but hope that the story could be used to protect someone else, that the decades of pain could be transformed into a warning with practical weight, that the town could become more vigilant without becoming paranoid, that families could teach their children awareness without teaching them terror. And that is a delicate balance, because fear is easy to spread, but resilience takes work. Still, on certain nights, when the humidity sits heavy and the streetlights paint long shadows across the pavement, people in that Florida neighborhood still feel it, the old silence, not because the case is unsolved, but because the case is unforgettable, because there are parts of the story that will always be missing, parts that will always belong to the dark space between what happened and what can be proven, and in that space, the imagination never stops searching. And as the town learned to live with the answer it finally received, it also learned to live with the truth that some mysteries don't vanish when a case is closed, they just change their shape, becoming questions that aren't meant for courtrooms or headlines, but for the quiet places inside people where the past still lingers, whispering that safety is fragile, that routine is not protection, and that sometimes the most ordinary moment, a traffic stop, a name on a screen, a second glance, can pull the buried past back into the present with enough force to change everything again. What haunted people most wasn't the spectacle of the arrest or the finality of the verdict. It was the slow realization that the truth had been walking past them for years, wearing the mask of normal life, and once that mask was removed, the past began to leak into the present in 1,000 small ways, in things people had dismissed, in moments that had felt insignificant, in instincts they had ignored because ignoring them was easier than living every day on edge. In the weeks after the trial, conversations changed shape, not the loud ones you hear on television, but the quiet ones, the ones held in kitchens late at night with the lights low, the ones whispered between neighbors across fences, The ones that start with "Do you remember?" and end with a pause that says more than words ever could, because memory is a strange thing. It doesn't just store events, it stores feelings. And now those feelings had a new name attached to them. People began replaying the old timeline like a film that suddenly makes sense in a different language, taking the same scenes and hearing different meanings. That afternoon stop at the store, that evening routine, that car in the driveway, that door left unlocked, and the question was no longer only what happened to her, but what did we miss, what did we walk past, what did we normalize, because if the answer had been near them, then their ignorance felt like a second kind of crime even though it wasn't their fault. A neighbor who had once brushed off a strange encounter now wondered if it had been a warning. A co-worker who had dismissed an odd comment now heard it differently, and none of these recollections were solid enough to become evidence. But they became something else. They became emotional proof that the town had been living beside a hidden story, and that idea unsettled everyone more than the official facts did. Law enforcement reviewed their own history too, not publicly at first because departments prefer confidence over introspection, but privately, detectives asked hard questions not out of guilt but out of necessity, because every cold case solved by chance forces you to confront the uncomfortable reality that chance was required, that the system didn't catch it on its own, that if the traffic stop had never happened, the case might still be sleeping in a box. They looked at old tip logs, handwritten notes, faded addresses, phone calls that had once seemed irrelevant, and they found what every investigation finds when it looks back. Gaps, not always mistakes, sometimes just limitations, a missing follow-up, a witness interview that didn't happen because there weren't enough hours in the day, a lead that went quiet and couldn't be revived, and each gap felt sharper now, because hindsight turns everything into a choice. Some of the officers who worked the original investigation were older now, retired, living in quieter rhythms, and when the news reached them, it hit with complicated force, relief mixed with something darker. The sting of knowing the case had outlived their careers, the weight of wondering whether they had stood closer to the truth than they realized and simply failed to see it. And some of them didn't want interviews, didn't want cameras, didn't want praise or blame, they just sat with the knowledge that one missing person report in 1997 had followed them like a shadow across decades. But the most volatile question wasn't about paperwork or procedure, it was about proximity, about how close the suspect had been to everyday life, and once people began mapping that proximity, the town's emotional geography changed. A street corner became suspicious, a familiar convenience store felt different, a route someone drove every day became a reminder that routine is not protection, that familiarity can be a trap, and suddenly places that had once been neutral became charged with memory. You could feel it in small behaviors, doors locked a little faster, porch lights left on without anyone pretending it was symbolic anymore, parents asking where their kids are in that tone that tries to sound casual and fails, neighbors scanning a little longer before waving hello, because trust is not a switch you flip back on after it's been shaken, it's a muscle and fear weakens it. And then there were the stories about him, the suspect, stories that emerged like debris after a storm, things people claimed to remember, things people insisted had always been obvious, and you could hear the town trying to rewrite its own past to make it less frightening, because it's easier to believe you ignored warning signs than to accept that there were none, that the danger was quiet enough to blend into the wallpaper of normal life. Some people painted him as distant, odd, someone who kept to himself too much, others described him as polite, forgettable, perfectly ordinary, and that split in perception revealed something uncomfortable about communities. We see what we expect to see, and when we don't expect danger we don't label it, we file it under nothing, because nothing is safe, nothing lets you move through your day without flinching. The family, meanwhile, lived inside a different kind of aftermath, one that didn't involve gossip or community anxiety, but raw personal recalibration, because for years they had lived on a knife edge between hope and grief, and now the edge had shifted, forcing them to rebuild their inner world around a truth that arrived too late to feel like victory. They sorted through old belongings again, not because they needed reminders, but because reminders were all they had, and in doing so they found the artifacts of waiting, notes, calendars, letters unsent, the careful documentation of a life interrupted, and each item became heavier now, because it no longer belonged to an open question, it belonged to a concluded fact, and facts don't comfort the way possibilities do. They also faced something no one prepares you for, the way solved invites strangers into your grief, because once a case is in the news again, people feel entitled to it, they talk about it over coffee, they comment on it online, they debate it like a plot, and the family had to endure the strange sensation of watching the most painful story of their lives become a public conversation with opinions attached to it, as if suffering were something that could be rated, analyzed, consumed. Investigators tried to shield them where they could, but protection is limited when the world is hungry for narrative, and the world is always hungry, especially for stories that contain a twist, a shock, a long-awaited arrest, because those stories flatter the human need to believe that everything eventually comes to light. But what the public often doesn't understand is that light can be harsh. It exposes everything, not just the suspect, not just the case, but the years in between, the years when the family kept moving despite exhaustion, the years when siblings grew up with a missing person shaped into their identities, the years when parents aged with unanswered questions pressing on their shoulders, and in the glare of renewed attention, those years suddenly became visible again. And visibility is not always kindness. The town tried to create meaning from it all, because humans can't live comfortably with randomness, and the phrase routine traffic stop became almost mythic, repeated like a parable, proof that vigilance matters, proof that small actions can ripple outward, and officers were praised for instincts, for persistence, for refusing to dismiss a feeling, and while that praise was earned, it also carried an uncomfortable implication. What about the times instincts fail? What about the cases that never get their traffic stop, never get their second chance? That question lingered in the halls of the department too, motivating some and haunting others, because once you see that time doesn't bury the truth, it just delays it, you start to wonder how many other truths are waiting. How many other boxes hold the same kind of silent scream? How many families are still living inside the endless loop of maybe? And that awareness can either make a department stronger or crush it under the weight of what it can't solve fast enough. As months passed, the community began its slow return to routine, but routine now had a bruise, visible only when pressed, a tenderness beneath normal life, and sometimes it surfaced unexpectedly, in a conversation about safety, in a documentary on television, in a traffic stop seen on the side of the road. Because now people couldn't see a patrol car's flashing lights without thinking about how easily the past can be pulled forward, how quickly decades can collapse into one moment. And in that collision of past and present, one truth became impossible to ignore. The case wasn't just a story about a crime, it was a story about attention, about the thin margin between noticed and unnoticed, about how the world can swallow someone whole if no one is looking closely enough, and how the smallest detail, a name typed into a database, a memory that refuses to settle a second glance, can become the difference between forever unsolved and finally named. But even then, even with everything on paper, even with justice processed through courtrooms and headlines, the deepest dread remained the same, the dread that had begun on that first night of silence. That there are things you can't rewind, that some losses don't become lighter with answers, they simply become sharper, and the community learned to live with that sharpness, carrying it quietly through daily life, because that's what people do when something extraordinary breaks into their ordinary world. They keep going, but they never move through it the same way again. By the time the town tried to breathe again, it had already been changed in ways that didn't show up in headlines, because headlines end where real life begins, and real life is where the consequences settle, slow and stubborn, into the habits of people who still have to wake up, go to work, drive the same roads, and pretend that the ordinary is solid when they've learned the hard way that it can fracture without warning. The family learned that first because while the world celebrated the concept of justice like a trophy, the family experienced it like weather, something that arrives and soaks everything, something you can't control, something that seeps into corners you forgot existed. Because the arrest didn't just close a case, it reopened a life, it dragged every memory back into the room and demanded that it be looked at again, not through the lens of hope, but through the lens of certainty, and certainty is a heavy thing when you've survived by living inside possibility. For years, their days had been shaped by waiting for a phone call, waiting for a credible lead, waiting for a stranger to recognize a face, waiting for a knock at the door that could mean anything. And waiting becomes a rhythm, a strange, exhausting rhythm, the kind that builds its own architecture inside a person. Because when you wait long enough, you stop picturing an ending and you start picturing a loop. You start believing the question will outlive you, and then suddenly, without warning, the loop breaks, and the break doesn't feel like freedom, it feels like falling. They tried to describe it to people who meant well, people offering words like closure and finally and at least now. And the family smiled politely because politeness is armor. But inside, the phrases clanged hollow, because what had ended wasn't grief, it was uncertainty, and uncertainty had been the last thin string holding their imagination to a future in which she might still walk through a door A future that allowed them to keep a part of themselves suspended in hope even when their rational minds knew better. Now the rational mind and the emotional mind had to meet, and that meeting was not gentle, it was a collision, because grief that has been delayed doesn't disappear, it accumulates, and when certainty arrives after years, it doesn't just bring one grief, it brings all the grief that was postponed, stacked neatly behind daily life, and suddenly it spills, and you realize how much you have been carrying without naming it. There were practical things, too, the kind people don't talk about because they sound too mundane for tragedy: paperwork, old records, legal documents, questions about belongings, about what gets preserved and what gets let go. And each form, each signature felt like another small betrayal, because to sign something is to admit permanence, and permanence is the one thing families of missing people spend years resisting. In quiet moments, they spoke about her in ways they hadn't allowed themselves to for a long time. Not just the missing person, not just the case, but the person, the laugh, the habits, the quirks, the small daily rituals that made her real. And these details were both comfort and pain, because remembering her fully meant confronting the full size of what was stolen, not just her life, but the future that should have unfolded naturally around it. The community watched the family navigate this new reality and didn't always know how to respond, because communities are good at reacting to emergencies and bad at living with aftermath. And once the trial ended, people wanted to move on. They wanted the story to become history, but the family couldn't move on in the same way, because for them, the story was not a news cycle, it was a calendar of years carved by absence, and that calendar did not erase itself just because the court said guilty or responsible. Some people offered support with sincerity, meals dropped off, letters written, candles lit, gestures meant to say, "We see you, we remember," and those gestures mattered, but they also highlighted a painful truth. People had been trying to help for decades, and nothing had been enough to change the one thing the family needed most, which was time. Time was the enemy and the witness, time was what the suspect had relied on as camouflage, time was what had allowed a life to fade from public attention, time was what had reshaped the town, remodeled it, repainted it, built new businesses, tore down old ones, time was what had carried children into adulthood, time was what had turned urgency into fatigue. And now time was what made the resolution feel both miraculous and cruel. Miraculous because it arrived at all, cruel because it arrived so late. The detectives felt that, too, even if they couldn't say it publicly, because solving a cold case doesn't always feel like triumph, sometimes it feels like a debt finally paid with interest, because the payment includes not just the answer, but the years of silence, the years when families lived in limbo, and investigators who care don't just feel pride, they feel the weight of what couldn't be given back. There were moments when the town tried to turn the case into a lesson, a public statement, a story about perseverance and the power of modern forensics, and those elements were real, but they were not the core, because the core was human. The core was a person who never came home, a family who waited too long, and a community that learned slowly that safety is not guaranteed by daylight or by familiar streets. People started telling the story to newcomers differently now, less like gossip, more like warning, more like history that matters, and in the telling, you could hear the town trying to reconcile itself with what it had endured. Because towns are like people, they create narratives to survive, and this narrative needed a shape that made sense, a shape that didn't leave them trapped in fear. They clung to the idea that the case was solved because of vigilance, because someone paid attention during a routine traffic stop, and that idea became almost sacred because it suggested that ordinary people, ordinary officers, could make an extraordinary difference, and that is a comforting thought, the belief that the world can be nudged toward justice by small acts of attention. But there was a darker truth beneath that comfort, because if a case can be solved by a traffic stop, it means it can also remain unsolved if that traffic stop never happens, if that officer is too tired, too distracted, too busy, if the name never gets typed, if the feeling gets dismissed as nothing. And the town understood that, too, even if they didn't say it, and it turned their gratitude into something sharper, something laced with the knowledge that luck had played a role. And luck is not a system you can trust. As the months passed, the family found themselves in a strange new territory, no longer searching, no longer hoping in the same way, but still aching, still living with a silence that had changed its meaning but not its presence, and in that territory, they began to see how the case had shaped them, how it had hardened some parts and softened others, how it had taught them to endure, how it had taught them to distrust easy answers, how it had taught them to live with uncertainty until certainty finally arrived and demanded a different kind of strength. They were asked, inevitably, what they wanted people to remember, and some of them answered with the only truth that mattered. Remember her as a person, not as a headline, not as a case file, not as a symbol for tragedy or a lesson about crime, but as a person who existed fully before the disappearance turned her into a story. That desire collided with the media machine again, because even respectful coverage can flatten a life into a few images and a few lines of biography, and the family watched those old photographs circulate once more, the same smile, the same portrait used again and again as if one moment could represent a whole existence, and they felt the strange pain of seeing her face everywhere while still living without her presence. In quiet moments, the town returned to the original street, not as a crowd, not as an event, but as individuals who found themselves driving past, walking past, looking past, as if their bodies remembered what their minds had tried to bury, and the street looked normal. Of course it did, because places don't carry visible scars unless humans mark them, but people looked anyway, searching for something, some residue of the night, some sign that the universe had acknowledged what happened there. And they found only the ordinary, and that ordinariness felt like insult and mercy at the same time. It was in those ordinary spaces that the case's final emotional truth revealed itself. The real horror wasn't just that someone vanished, it was that life kept going as if she hadn't, that the world moved on without permission, and even now, even after the verdict, life still moved on, and the family still had to live inside that motion, still had to find a way to coexist with a reality that would never align with what should have been. In the end, the case didn't just expose a perpetrator, it exposed an era, the limitations of 1997, the blind spots of a system, the gaps in a community's attention, and it exposed something deeper, something that makes cold cases so haunting. That the past doesn't stay quiet, it waits, it lingers, it presses against the present until a crack opens and it floods back in, demanding to be acknowledged. And as Florida tried to settle into the new truth, the last question that haunted them wasn't about evidence or court strategy, it was about the shape of the years. What does a community do with decades of waiting once the wait is over? How do you release a story that has been holding your breath for so long? Because when you live inside a cold case, you don't just lose a person, you lose a sense of time itself, and even when justice arrives, time doesn't reset, it only keeps moving forward, leaving you to follow behind with everything you couldn't carry before. In the end, what people want from a story like this is a clean line, a final sentence, something that lands with certainty and lets the mind relax, but Florida learned the hard way that real endings don't arrive like that. Not when the beginning was a silence that stretched for decades, not when the middle was built from waiting, and not when the conclusion came so late it had to push through layers of grief that had already hardened into identity. The file can be stamped, the case can be closed, the court can record its decision in ink, but the human part doesn't close in the same way, because the human part is not paperwork, it's memory, it's habit, it's the way a family still reaches for a phone in the middle of the night out of instinct, the way a mother still turns her head when she thinks she hears a familiar laugh, the way a sibling still sees her age frozen at the last known moment, unchanged while everyone else grows older, and no verdict can rewrite that internal timeline. No verdict can give back the years that were stolen quietly, one ordinary day at a time. The community, too, carries it differently now, because what once felt like a local nightmare has become a local fact. And facts are heavier than rumors. Rumors can be pushed aside. Facts settle in the foundations of how people see their own streets, their own routines, their own assumptions, and in Florida, people began to recognize the subtle ways the case had shaped them even before it was solved, how it had made them lock doors earlier, how it had made them glance twice at a stranger, how it had made them cautious with a caution they couldn't fully explain to anyone who didn't live through it. They tell the story differently now, not with the nervous excitement of mystery, but with the sober tone of history, and that shift matters because mystery invites entertainment, history demands respect, and the town began to insist, quietly but firmly, that this was not just a case, not just a headline, not just a twist revealed by science and luck. It was a life interrupted, a family reshaped, a community taught to distrust the comfort of routine. Even the words changed meaning. Cold case. Once it sounded distant, clinical, like something that happens elsewhere. Now it feels personal, like a scar you can't see until you touch it. Routine traffic stop. Once it meant nothing. Now it means the thin thread that connected two eras, the 90s and the modern world, the era of paper files and the era of databases, and somewhere between them, a truth that had been walking around free, unseen, unchallenged, protected by time and anonymity until a moment of ordinary law enforcement turned into the hinge on which everything swung. People still debate the role of chance because chance is difficult to accept, And the idea that justice arrived because an officer felt something off and decided to look again is both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it proves vigilance matters, terrifying because it suggests how close this case came to remaining unsolved forever. How easily the world could have continued moving forward, while the truth stayed buried in an evidence box that no one opened again. In quiet conversations, you hear the questions that never found a home in court. Where did it begin exactly? How close was it to being stopped? How many times did he pass someone who would have been horrified if they'd known what he carried in his history? How many times did he sit at a stoplight, wait in line, exchange pleasantries, while a family lived inside uncertainty, while a community lived inside caution? Those questions don't have answers that satisfy, and that's part of the lingering dread, because when you can't fully map the past, you can't fully protect the future, you can only watch more carefully and hope that watchfulness is enough. For the family, the end of the case was the beginning of a different kind of grief, the kind that doesn't have the adrenaline of searching, the kind that doesn't have the false comfort of possibility, the kind that is simply there, undeniable, unmovable. And they discovered that after years of waiting, the mind doesn't know how to stop waiting overnight. It keeps listening for news, keeps expecting updates, keeps scanning the world for a face that will never appear. Because habits formed by trauma don't dissolve just because the story has changed. They also face the strange cruelty of public celebration, people congratulating them as if justice were a gift, as if the solution were a prize, as if this were a victory rather than a tragedy that finally found a name. And they learn to respond with grace, because grace is sometimes the only way to survive other people's ignorance. But inside, the truth was simple. There is no winning here, there is only living with what remains. What remains is a name spoken with intention, not as a missing person label, but as a full person, with a life that existed beyond the crime. What remains is the echo of her absence in ordinary places. What remains is the way certain dates still feel heavy. What remains is the way the family still imagines the version of the world where she came home that night, the version where the porch light was just a porch light, not a symbol, the version where the street remained just a street, not a crime scene remembered by an entire town. And what remains is the community's quiet transformation, because people do not return to innocence once they lose it, they return to routine, yes, but routine now has edges, routine is now something they respect rather than assume, and that shift is subtle but permanent, a change in posture, a change in tone, a change in the way they look at a stranger and wonder, for the smallest fraction of a second, what story might be hiding behind a face. In the years that follow, the case will drift again in the public mind, as all cases do, replaced by newer mysteries, newer tragedies, newer headlines. But in Florida it will not drift completely, because local memory is stubborn, and the people who live through it will carry it like a weather system, something that can roll in unexpectedly, triggered by a documentary, a podcast, a newspaper article, a traffic stop seen on the side of the road, red and blue lights pulsing against the dark, and suddenly the past is back, whispering, reminding, insisting. There will be new families in the neighborhood who didn't live through 1997, who see only quiet houses and sunshine and palm trees, and the older neighbors will tell them the story not to scare them, but to teach them, not with paranoia, but with a kind of sober awareness, because this case has become a lesson in what attention can save and what attention can miss, a lesson in how quickly the ordinary can become the unspeakable. And still, even with that lesson, even with every precaution, the unease never disappears fully, because the core horror of this story is not only what happened, but how it happened, quietly, efficiently, without leaving the kinds of clues that people expect crime to leave. And the absence of chaos is what makes it so haunting, because it suggests a world where danger doesn't always announce itself, where the most devastating moment can look like a normal moment from the outside. And if that's true, then safety is not a guarantee, it's a constant negotiation. That's why the final image of this story isn't a courtroom or a set of handcuffs. It's a street at night, Florida humidity hanging in the air, streetlights casting long, pale pools across the pavement, the sound of distant traffic moving like ocean waves, and somewhere in that quiet, the echo of a house that once felt wrong because a person didn't come home, a silence that lasted for decades, and even now, even after solved, the silence is still there, changed in meaning but not in presence, like a shadow that shifts with the sun but never leaves. A cold case can be closed, but it cannot be erased. It becomes part of the town's bones, part of the family's bloodstream, part of the way people measure time. It teaches them that the past is patient, that truth can hide for years, that justice can arrive through strange doors, and that even when it does, it doesn't undo what was taken. It only names it, And naming is not healing. Naming is acknowledgement, a beginning of acceptance that hurts because it is real. And as Florida moves forward, as seasons change and the world keeps spinning, the case lingers not as a mystery anymore, but as a warning carved into memory. Pay attention, because ordinary moments can carry extraordinary consequences, and because somewhere out there, in the spaces between routine and vigilance, the line between safe and gone is thinner than anyone wants to believe, and the only thing that makes the line visible is the story itself, told again and again, not for entertainment, not for spectacle, but so the silence that began in 1997 is never allowed to swallow another life without someone noticing. The file closes, the ink dries, the headlines fade, but in that Florida neighborhood, on certain nights when the air is still and the world feels too quiet, people swear they can feel the past pressing gently against the present, not to reopen the case, not to demand another verdict, but simply to remind them of the one truth this story leaves behind like an aftertaste. You can outlive a mystery, but you cannot outlive its shadow.